Concept video 4, building verbal message skills. So here are our checkpoints. We're going to learn what verbal message communication competency looks like. We're going to talk about how we can improve semantics, improve pragmatics, and improve sociolinguistics. All right, so verbal message communication competency. What exactly does this mean? When we learn about in the first chapter, what is communication competency, it's really learning how to be an effective communicator regardless of the context or the situations that you're in. So when it comes to verbal message communication competency, what does it mean? It means becoming efficient at effectively and ethically tailoring verbal messages to achieve shared meaning and avoid miscommunication. What does that look like? So learning to quickly and accurately recognize contextual, perceptual, and cultural influences on a communication situation, and also constructing verbal messages to achieve your intended meaning. So looking at all aspects of a situation and being very mindful in the middle of those situations to figure out what is the best way to communicate my message and get the intended meaning across. And then why is it important? So being really good at constructing verbal messages that are truly respectful and ethical and easily understood, that really helps with strengthening relationships. It helps with being perceived positively because you sound very articulate and people are able to understand you well. It's wanted by employers. Employers want people who can effectively communicate, and a lot of times we see that through verbal communication. And then it meets your communication goals or your communication needs. So remember, while language is kind of like our vessel for how we communicate, our communication is really like why we use communication is for all different reasons, but especially there's some communication needs that we have, whether that is developing friendships or seeming like we're knowledgeable on a topic. All of those things have to do with our communication needs. So learning how to construct a solid verbal message is going to help you do that. Okay, so here are the ways that we can improve semantics. So remember, semantics is like, what do the words actually mean? So this is more about clarity. How clear are you when you're constructing a message? So we want to use specific language. And so that means saying something like, for example, saying Ford Mustang versus a car. So if you're telling someone a story, having that specific language will help narrow what you mean for the listener. And then use concrete language. So specific and concrete, those two things sometimes I think get mixed up. There's semantics get mixed up. But concrete language is looking more so at appealing to the five senses. So something making it a little bit more concrete or tangible is another word you could use that in the listener's mind. So an example of this would be, Helen was very attached to her Ford Mustang. So I was specific in that I said Ford Mustang instead of car. And then I also was more concrete because I said that she was Helen, was very attached. And so very attached is would be better word choice than just saying Helen liked her car. Well, what do you mean by like? There's lots of reasoning, or there's lots of ways of looking at the word like. So saying very attached would make that better. Then use familiar language. So sometimes we get, especially if you're so knowledgeable on a topic, sometimes you say words or phrases that people may not readily know, especially if they're not in your speech community or the co-culture that says this word a lot. So you want to try to avoid jargon or slang, especially if you don't know the person extremely well. So here's an example. Helen was very attached to her Ford Mustang because she thought it was cool. So that would be like cool is at this current point a pretty transcendable word. What I mean by that is like that kind of regardless of your generation, as long as you're in the American English speech community, usually you could say you can say that word. Like you could say cool and people understand what you mean by that. Now you might want to think about that when you go, if you were to go to England, there might be a shifting word for that. But for the most part, cool would be an acceptable choice. That's a familiar language. On the opposite of that, you might say Helen liked her car because she thought it was dope. Dope, while I would say several generations in our speech community, if you are part of the English speaking speech community, American English, that would, I think a lot of us would know that one, but not always. Like my mom, like probably wouldn't know that. Like her generation wouldn't know what you meant by dope. So especially if you're speaking to someone whose English is not their first language, using familiar language or very specific, concrete language is going to be helpful because they may not know what you mean by dope, but they would know maybe what you mean by cool based on their language development as they learn the English language. Okay, so step 4, use descriptive details and examples. So this means like kind of surrounding the information with relevant and helpful details, not just like an abundance of details that aren't necessary, but specific details that will help better understand the message. So an example would be Helen was very attached to her 2004 Ford Mustang because she thought it was cool to have this as a first car in high school. So obviously this is a longer sentence, but it's very clear. Like this is like the car was an older car. It was Helen's first car. Now you understand why she's probably so attached to it. And there's a lot more detail and depth to that sentence than saying Helen liked her old car because she thought it was dope back in the day. Okay, yeah, that kind of works. But back in the day, if you're not, that is kind of while we may not think, some of us may not think that is jargon. Again, think about if English wasn't your first language, what would that mean to you back in the day? Also, saying just old, that doesn't really tell us a whole lot about it. We also don't know what kind of car Helen had, and she liked it. Okay, but I don't really know what exactly, just she thought it was nice. She thought it was. I guess she thought it was cool. I don't know. So you want to be more defined with that. And then demonstrate linguistic sensitivity. So use language that is inclusive and demonstrates respect for others. I think there's been a real push for this, which I think is great. This means that you're using words that, like not using words that apply only to one sex or race or other group or whole culture. Some examples of this, while it doesn't go with the car example, here are some examples of what I mean. Like saying humankind versus mankind, or considering pronouns or asking if people want to share their pronouns, things like that. Okay, improving pragmatics. So the first one's pretty obvious, but let me redefine pragmatics. So pragmatics is not just, what does the word mean, but what does the person mean when they're saying it, based on the context, based on all the things, what do they mean? So this is like the first thing would be to tell the truth, say only what is true based on evidence, try limiting comments you can't back up fully. This also is kind of like the example I've said a lot is the example of my husband saying, after we've been in like a little bit of an argument, him saying, okay, are you okay? Is everything good? Me saying, I'm fine. And like looking away, like, I'm fine. That's not me telling the truth, right? And that's also not using pragmatics in a healthy or ethical way. So I'll want to make sure that in the future, if that were to happen, we should say, I'm not okay yet. Maybe in a little bit, I'll be okay to talk, but right now I just don't need a little space. Like that would be telling the truth, and that would be making our pragmatics line up with the actual meaning of our words. Okay, so provide the right amount of information. That should say amount. Provide the right amount of information. So include information that is relevant. I've always been kind of bad about this, especially growing up. My best friend used to always tell me, Helen, okay, point. Because I would just want to tell you the whole story. Now, sometimes I think that's okay. I like hearing the whole story. So if you ever tell me a story, feel free to tell me all the details. but for sometimes it can make it where the person listening doesn't really fully understand what you're sharing about, like, why are you telling me this information? So try recognizing when you're providing irrelevant or unhelpful advice or information regarding whatever you're saying. So example of that might be, let's see, recognizing when you're providing. So like say I'm telling a story and all of a sudden, like I start telling you about, oh, Sarah came to talk to me the other day, and oh, Sarah, Sarah's the, oh, I can't remember her last name. There, let's see, she works down the hallway. Sarah. So I think she is in whatchamacallit office. All those things are kind of irrelevant, especially if like the person listening to you is like, I don't even know who Sarah is. This is irrelevant to me, right? So make sure whatever you're saying within your story, or just what, it doesn't have to be a story, but like anytime that you're communicating, the information that goes into that should be relevant to your listener. All right, so relate what you say to the topic being discussed. So it's a really great tip to always say, especially if you're giving your opinion or something, telling the listener why you're telling them, instead of just like randomly saying something and not really telling them why. So noticing one of the things tips I said was try noticing when reasoning or information is not obvious and or assumed. So like if you were to ask a sibling to say, hey, can you go pick up our other sibling today? And your sibling said, oh, I have a test tomorrow. Okay. Like you're like that there. See, there's like a gap of information there. And be like, okay, cool. So can you pick up our sibling? Instead, your sibling could have said, "Oh, I'm studying right now. I'm actually really stressed because I'm kind of studying last minute for this test that I have tomorrow. So I can't. Is there any way that you could do it? If absolutely not, I can do it. But it would be great if I could just keep studying." That would be a good way of making sure that you're relating whatever you say, or that's a good example of relating what is said back to the topic. Okay, step 4, acknowledge when your message violates a guideline. So these are kind of what I call hedgers, or like kind of like you say this before a sentence to help the person understand why you're saying what you're saying. So I have 3 examples for you. Each one goes with with each of the first 3 steps, which would be like say that you are trying to give someone some information. You might say, that you're not completely positive on. So you might say, I don't know this for sure, but, and then proceed. Then for providing the right information, you could say, I realize this may be a bit off topic, but, and then telling them. And then finally, this may not be relevant to this conversation, but, so it's saying something. I know the last 2 are kind of similar, but I think they kind of work both ways. I just think that anytime that you're saying something that doesn't go along with what is being said in the moment, we should always say why we're doing that. Okay, and then finally, assume the best first. This is where I just kind of call this like, don't take offense right away. Don't pull like the victim card right away. If you're unsure of what someone means, then seek clarification and ask them. And I know sometimes this is hard, especially in our closer relationships where maybe there's been some like poor communication back and forth for a long time, but especially with new people we don't know that well, I'll always try to assume the best first. So I'm not taking offense right away if someone says something, kind of just seeking clarification on that. And I think that the best way to do this is to try giving people the benefit of the doubt by not making assumptions. Sometimes we assume things, and that's really not the case. All right, our final steps are improving sociolinguistics. So the first thing that we want to do when we think about sociolinguistics, which is like the the norms that have been established by the cultures that we're in that surround words and using words, we want to think about intercultural communication and competence. So chapter 3 lists out a whole guide of all the things that we can do, but since this video is already going a little longer than I intended, we're not going to go through all that. But you can go back and look at them because they're really important You may think like, oh, well, I'm not going to Europe anytime soon, so I don't really need to learn intercultural competence. But that's not the case. People sitting right beside you, they communicate differently because of the different cultures we're all a part of. So you want to think about that. Even a different culture, that is intercultural. That's not just two people speaking different languages. Okay, then practice mindfulness. Oh, wait, sorry. A tip for though is also learn about other cultures and other cultures, especially if there's some that you are going to be interacting with on a regular basis. All right, so practice mindfulness. And so the definition of mindfulness is the practice of paying attention to what is happening at any given moment during a conversation. Now, the reason this is so important is because this is putting the perception process to positive use. Like this is kind of taking in and being aware of all the way the conversation's going, noticing the differences between your communication style so that you can better construct your verbal messages. Those are things that you want to do. Pay attention. And later we're going to talk about listening. So we talk about active listening, and that's going to be a big part of that. And then respect and adapt to the sociolinguistic practices of others. Basically, avoid ethnocentrism, which is the belief that your way of doing things is the correct way. I know that's hard, but try to do that. And one of the things we can do that's really going to be helpful for adapting our sociolinguistic practices is adapting our verbal style to others. So this is not just changing who you are or anything like that, but recognizing if the person that you're speaking to speaks a very different verbal style, and might be offended by by your verbal style. And again, one of the things about being an ethical or effective communicator is that we have to lose this mentality of like, well, if you're offended, sorry, that's not how I meant it. Right, that's not how things work. To be an effective communicator, we actually want to understand people. We want to empathize. We want to be ethical. And not that we don't say what's truthful, but we also understand like how's what I'm going to say going to either hurt or help this person. And one of the ways we can do that is by paying attention to our verbal style. So anyways, I think that's all that I have for this video. But if you have any questions, obviously, let me know. You can post that at the end after this on the chapter clarification forum. So thanks for watching. That's it.